They hired me to run a woman off her land, and I rode 200 miles to do it, and I'd have done it too, if I'd been the man they thought they'd hired. That's the truth, and I've had near 40 years to sit with it. A man my age has earned the right to start a thing honest. I was a gun. I'd been a gun so long I'd stopped remembering I'd ever been anything else. There was a boy once, on a hard-scrabble place in the nations, who'd wanted to break horses and marry a girl named Lurin and die old in his own bed. That boy had gotten about as far as the marrying. Then a fever took Lurin and the child she was carrying in the same black week, and I buried them both under one stone because I couldn't afford two, and after that the boy was gone and there was just the gun. You can put a man in the ground and dig him up again, but you cannot put back what comes out of him when he stands over a single grave with two names on it. So when a letter found me in Sutter's Bend with $50 folded inside it and a promise of 50 more, signed in a heavy black hand by a man named Burl Ostrander, I read the words a problem wants handling, and I knew exactly the kind of work it was, and I saddled up and went. I didn't ask what the problem was. I never did. Asking was for men who still had something left to lose by the answer. Drywood sat in a cup of brown hills the color of old coffee, with the pale hills standing off to the north like a row of gravestones too big to read. There was a creek the maps called Mill Fork that ran through the middle of town muddy and thin, and there was another creek you couldn't see from the road, Coyote Wash, that ran cold and clean off the high country and never went dry even in the worst of a drought year. I learned about that second creek before I learned anything else worth knowing, because in a country dying of thirst, water is the only thing men truly hate each other over. Everything else is just the excuse. I came in off the South Road on a gray gelding I'd won in a card game and never named, and the first thing the town did was go quiet at me. That was nothing new. A man rides in wearing his iron tied down low and the talk dries up like spit on a stove. But this was a particular kind of quiet. They looked at me the way you'd look at a dog somebody else had sent for. They knew what I was. They'd called for me. And they hated themselves a little for it. And they hated me more, for being the proof of what they'd decided to do. Ostrander kept an office above the bank, which tells you most of what you need to know about Ostrander. He was a big man gone soft in the belly and hard everywhere else, with a gray mustache he kept waxed, and a way of looking at you like he was figuring your weight at market. He poured me a whiskey I didn't drink and got right to it, which I'll give him, because the men who talk in circles are usually the ones working up the nerve to cheat you. "There's a woman," he said, "out east of town on Coyote Wash, the old Vane place." "A woman," I said. "A murderess." He said the word the way a preacher says sin, with relish and a little fear. "Burned her own husband alive in his bed 2 summers back. Folks all know it. Judge couldn't prove it, no witness. The fire took everything, but folks know. She's living out there alone on land she's got no right to, poisoning the talk, frightening decent wives. The town wants her gone. I'm offering you good money to see that she goes." "Goes where?" He shrugged with his mustache. "Anywhere that isn't here, persuade her. I don't much care for the particulars. You're a man knows his trade." I knew my trade. That was the trouble with it. I'd persuaded men off land before, and I'd persuaded 1 or 2 clean off the earth, and I had never once asked whether the persuading was just, because justice was a word that belonged to other men, men with stones in 2 churchyards instead of 1. I took the $50. I rode out east to look at the problem before I handled it, the way you'd ride out to look at a horse before you bought it. I have asked myself 1,000 times what I expected to find at the Vane place. A wild-haired hag, maybe. Some broke-down witch crouched over a cold fire, the kind of woman a town invents because it's easier to drive out a monster than to look at a neighbor you've wronged. What I found was a woman in a faded blue dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, walking calm as Sunday through a yard full of bees. She had hives, you see. A dozen white boxes set in a neat row along the south fence, and the air over them was loud and golden with the work of them, and she moved among them without a net, without smoke, without any fear at all, talking low to them the way a body talks to stock. She was not young and she was not old, maybe 30. She had a face that had been pretty once and was something better than pretty now, which is to say it had been lived in, and the living showed. Brown hair pinned up and coming loose. Hands that worked. When she turned and saw me sitting my horse at the gate with my iron tied down, she did not startle and she did not run. She straightened and she looked at me, and she knew me for exactly what I was, the same as the town had known, and she did not look away. "You'd be the one Ostrander sent," she said. "I might be. You're not the first." She wiped her hands on her apron. "The others didn't sit their horses so long, they'd say their piece and ride off. You're studying me. Why?" I didn't have an answer that would have fit in my mouth, so I gave her the only honest thing I had. "I'm trying to see the murderess," I said. "I'm told there's one out here." Something moved across her face then, not anger, though she'd have had the right. Something more like weariness, the kind that's worn so smooth it doesn't even have edges left to cut you with. "You'll have to look closer than that," she said. "She's worn down to nothing by now. 2 years of being looked at'll do it." And she turned her back on me, turned her back on a man with a gun, like I was no more danger than the weather, and went back to her bees. I should have ridden off. That was the moment to ride off before anything got into me. Instead, I sat there and watched her work, and I thought about the word murderess, and I thought about how a town will hand a man a word and expect him to do murder with it, and never once make him look at the face the word's supposed to fit. And I found I could not get my horse to turn around, or I would not. I have never been able to say for certain which. I made a cold camp that night on the rise above her place, telling myself I was reconnoitering, the way a soldier does before a thing. From up there, I could see her lamp burning yellow in the window long after a tired woman should have been abed, and once I saw her come out on the porch and stand looking up at the hills, alone, a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the cold coming down off the pale hills, and there was something in the set of her that I knew. I'd stood like that. Over one stone with 2 names. A person stands like that when the grief has gone past tears into something quieter and more permanent, like a fence post grief has frozen into the ground. The next morning I rode down to her gate again, and I told myself it was to do my work, and that was a lie, and I think she knew it was a lie before I did. "I want to know about the fire," I said. She was hanging wash. She did not stop. "Why?" "Because the man paying me says you said it, and I find I'd like to hear you call him a liar if he is one." She turned with a wet shirt in her hands and looked at me a long moment. "And if I say I didn't do it, you'll believe me, just like that, when the whole town that watched me grow up won't." "I didn't say I'd believe you. I said I'd like to hear it." It was a small thing, but it was an honest thing, and I have come to learn that an honest small thing offered to a person who has been starved of honesty is a kind of bread. She hung the shirt. She came to the fence and put her hands on the top rail and looked at the hills, not at me, and she told me. Her husband's name had been Tobias Vane. A quiet man, a fair man, no fighter. He'd come west with a little money and a good heart and built up the place along Coyote Wash, the clean water, the bees, a few head of cattle. They'd had no children. That had been a grief, but a private one, and they'd made their peace with each other inside it the way 2 decent people do. And the place had prospered in its small way on account of the water, which was the whole trouble. "Coyote Wash never goes dry," she said. 3 years running we've had drought and mill forks near mud, and the big outfits are losing stock by the 100. And there's my creek, running cold and full off the high country on Tobias's deed, fair bought and fair held. She said it without pride, like reciting a fact at her own trial. Burl Ostrander wanted that water, came to Tobias with an offer, then a worse offer, then a threat dressed as an offer. Tobias said no. Tobias kept saying no. He had papers. He had the right of it. She paused. "And then one night 2 summers ago the house caught fire while I was out in the bee shed seeing to a hive that had swarmed sick, and by the time I ran back it was a wall of flame and Tobias was inside it, and I could not." She stopped. I did not fill the silence. A man learns, if he learns anything, when not to fill a silence. I could not get to him, she said, very quiet. I burned my hands trying. She turned them over on the rail, palms up, and I saw the old shine of scar across both of them, the smooth, bad skin where the hair won't grow back. And in the morning, when the ashes were cold and when there was nothing left to do for Tobias, the town had already decided. By noon the story was set. The childless wife, the loveless marriage they'd invented for me. The fire she set for the land, or the spite, or the Lord knows what. By the time the circuit judge came, every soul in Drywood had told the story to every other soul so many times it had gone hard as a brick, and there was nothing the judge could do but say he couldn't prove it, which everybody heard, as he couldn't catch her. Ostrander made sure of that. Ostrander, she said, and now there was something under the weariness, something with edges after all, has spent 2 years buying up every note and every favor and every frightened man in this county, and what he's bought is the certainty that I'm a murderess. Because a murderess can be run off. A grieving widow holding a fair deed cannot. He needed me to be the one thing the law would let him take everything from. The bees hummed. A long way off a dog was barking at nothing, the way they do. That's the story, she said. You can ride back and tell Ostrander I'm still here, and I'm not leaving, and he can send 100 of you, and I will be standing in this yard when the last one rides off. This is Tobias's ground. He's buried on it. I'd sooner burn with it than hand it to the man who burned him. I have heard a great many men make a great many speeches over the barrel of my gun. They mostly run to begging, or to bluster, which is begging that's ashamed of itself. I had never in my life heard anything like the flat, tired iron in that woman's voice. A woman with scarred hands and no friend in the world telling a hired killer she'd sooner burn than yield. I knew, sitting there, that she meant every word. And I knew something else, something that sat down in my chest like a stone settling, that I believed her, not chose to, did, the way you believe the sun's up. There was not enough lie in that whole worn-down woman to cover a postage stamp, and I had spent 20 years learning to smell a lie, and there was none. I'll be going, I said. Go on then. But I didn't ride to Ostrander. I rode back up to my rise, and I sat there the rest of that day, and I had a long, hard conversation with the only man whose opinion I'd ever respected enough to hate, which was myself. Because I knew Ostrander would not stop at sending men one at a time. A man who will burn another man in his bed and frame his widow, for it has already gone past the place where reason lives. He'd waited 2 years for the brand to set hard enough. He'd want it finished before some new judge or some new winter rain ruined his drought. And a man like that, when the lone guns don't work, sends the mob. The drink and the dark and the borrowed courage of a crowd. That was coming. I could feel it coming the way you feel weather in an old wound. I want to be plain about something, because I have heard this story told back to me over the years with the wrong shape on it, made into something it wasn't. I did not ride down off that rise to save her. I want that understood. A woman who will stand in her own yard and tell a killer she'll burn before she'll run does not need saving, and to call it that is to take from her the one thing the town hadn't managed to take, which was that she did it standing up, on her own ground, by her own choice. What I rode down to do was simpler and more selfish than saving. I rode down because I had spent 20 years being the thing men like Ostrander sent, and I was tired clear to the bone of it, and here at last was one I could refuse. Refusing him was the first free thing I'd done since I'd dug that grave. That's the truth of it. She gave me the chance to be a man again, and I have never been able to pay her back for it, though God knows I've spent a life trying. It came 4 nights later, like I knew it would. I'd taken to camping closer, down in the cottonwoods by the wash where I could watch the road, and I told her I was doing it because sneaking would have been one more lie and she'd had her fill of those. She hadn't thanked me. She'd looked at me a long time and said, "I don't know what you're about, mister, and I'll tell you plain I don't trust it, but the cottonwoods are free ground. Camp where you like." Which was, from her, about the same as an embrace. Twice she'd brought me coffee out to the trees, set it on a stump and walked off without a word, and the coffee was good and strong, and it was the first thing anyone had given me instead of paid me, in longer than I could count. That fourth night I heard them coming a half-mile off, the loose sloppy noise a drunk crowd makes, men who have worked their nerve up out of a bottle and need to keep talking loud to keep it up. Torches. A dozen riders, maybe 15, with Ostrander's foreman, a flat-eyed man named Loomis out front, and behind him the ordinary men of Drywood, the storekeep and the smith and somebody's grown sons, men who'd have crossed the street to avoid this in daylight and had told themselves the dark and the crowd made it different. They had coal oil. I could smell it. They meant to burn her out and call it justice, the same way Ostrander had burned Tobias and called it her crime. I stepped my horse out of the cottonwoods and into the road and stopped square in the middle of it, and I let them ride up on me, and I did not draw. That last part matters. I want it told right. I did not draw. They pulled up in a ragged bunch, the torches throwing everybody's face into something ugly and uncertain. Loomis spat. "Halloran, you're on the wrong side of the fence. Ostrander pays you to clear that woman, not stand in the road like a fence post." "Ostrander pays me," I agreed. "I'm giving the money back. Tell him." I looked past Loomis at the others, at the storekeep whose name I'd learned was Prout, at the smith, at the two boys who couldn't have been more than 19 and looked like they wanted to be anywhere on earth but there. "The rest of you," I said, "go home." "You don't give the orders here," Loomis said. "No," I said, "I don't. Tonight nobody does. Tonight every man here decides for himself whether he's the kind that burns a woman out of her bed in the dark on the say-so of a man who won't ride out here himself to watch it done." I let that sit. "Where is Ostrander tonight, Loomis? Home in his bed. Funny. The crime he's accused that woman of is burning a man in his. Seems a thing a fellow ought to do his own self if he's so sure it's righteous." It went quiet. Even the torches seemed to gutter. "She killed her husband," somebody said from the back. But it came out thin. A man saying a thing because he'd been saying it 2 years and didn't know how to stop. "Did she?" I said. "Were you there? Were any of you there? Or did Burl Ostrander hand you that word the morning after his own dirty work and you've been carrying it for him ever since, free of charge, doing the one piece of his murder he couldn't do himself, which was make it stick?" I looked at the smith. "You've got daughters, I'm told. Suppose it was one of them. Suppose her man died and a rich neighbor wanted her land and put a word in the town's mouth. How many nights would it take, you reckon, before your neighbors came up the road with torches to finish what the rich man started? A man cannot be argued out of a thing the bottle put into him, but a mob is not one thing. It is a dozen frightened men, each privately hopping somebody else will be the first to back down so they can call it following. I had counted on that. I had been a mob's errand boy enough times to know its weak place, which is that not one man in it truly wants to be the one whose hand struck the match, if only somebody gives him a door out. I was the door. "This is your door," I told them. "You can ride home tonight and be men who almost did a terrible thing and live with the almost, which is a thing a man can live with. Or you can ride past me, and I'll kill the first 3 of you that try, and the rest of you'll carry the other thing the rest of your lives, and that's a thing no man lives with." Whatever he tells himself. I had not raised my voice. I have found you don't need to when you mean it, and I meant it. Go home. Enough. This is enough. It hung on a knife's edge. Loomis wanted blood. He was Ostrander's all the way through, and he reached. And I'll tell you that I was faster. I'd always been faster. That was the whole sorry sum of my life's accomplishment. And I put a bullet through the meat of his gun arm before his iron cleared leather. 1 shot, no more. And it spun him out of the saddle, and that was the end of the only fighting there was. Because the others did not reach. The smith looked at the boys, and the boys looked at the ground, and old Prout the storekeep said in a cracked voice, "I never wanted no part of this. I want it said. I never wanted no part of it." And he turned his horse, and once one turned they all turned, the way they always do, a mob coming apart back into the separate ashamed men it was made of. They left Loomis groaning in the dust, and they rode back the way they'd come, slower than they'd left and quieter. I climbed down and took Loomis's guns and tied off his arm so he wouldn't bleed to death, because I am not Ostrander and never wished to be. And I sat him on his horse and pointed it at town and slapped its rump. And then I turned around and Esther Vane was standing at her gate in her nightdress with an old shotgun in her scarred hands. And she'd been standing there the whole time, ready to die on her own ground exactly as she'd promised. And she was looking at me like she'd never in her life seen the thing she was looking at. "You shot Ostrander's man," she said. "I did. For me." "No," I said, and I meant it, and I think it was the meaning of it that undid her because she'd been ready for everything but that. "For me. I've been somebody's loomies my whole life, ma'am. Tonight I quit." I holstered my iron. "You can put the scattergun down, or don't. It's your ground." She looked at me a while. Then she lowered the hammers careful, the way a person handles a thing they respect and fear, and she said, "There's coffee on. You'd best come in. You're shaking, mister, even if you don't know it." I was too, first time in 20 years. That was the night it turned. Not into anything quick. I want to be honest about that. The way the town tells it gets too quick makes it sound like a thunderclap, and it wasn't. It was slow as honey in cold weather. But it turned. I stayed on. There was no talking about it. I just didn't leave, and she didn't tell me to. And after a few days I was mending the corral I'd noticed was down. And after a few more I was helping with the hives, learning to move slow and easy among them the way she did, getting stung plenty at first and learning. "Bees won't abide a man who's afraid or a man who's angry. They feel it off you," she said. "They feel everything off you. You can't lie to a bee." And so to work the hives I had to learn to set down the fear and the anger I'd carried so long I'd thought they were my own bones. It was the bees taught me that, and Esther taught the bees, so it was Esther really, the long way round. We didn't talk much at first, and when we did it was about work. The price of comb in the county, whether the gray gelding could be broke to harness. The weather, always the weather, the drought that wouldn't break. But a man and a woman who work side by side through the long light of summer days come to know each other in a way that has nothing to do with talking, and everything to do with the 100 small kindnesses of shared labor. The dipper of water handed across without being asked, the held gate, the look that means rain coming, get the wash in. I came to know the sound of her step. She came to know, I think, that the killer the town feared was a man who handled the hives gentle and couldn't abide to see a thing in pain, who put out a saucer of milk for a half-wild barn cat and pretended he hadn't. One evening late, with the lamp low, she told me the rest, about Tobias. Not the dying, I knew that, but the man. How he'd read to her of an evening, though she'd had her letters and could read her own self, but she liked his voice. How he'd never raised his hand or his voice to her in 11 years. How the town's invention of a loveless marriage had been a special cruelty laid on top of the rest, because they'd taken her grief and called it her motive, made her love into a lie to convict her with. "I did love him," she said, looking at the lamp. "Quiet but true, and they made even that into a weapon. That's the thing I can't," and she stopped, and I saw the hands tighten, and I did not reach for them, though I wanted to. It was too soon, and she was not a thing to be reached for. She was a woman to be waited for, and I had learned to wait. A man who's nothing but a gun never learns to wait. A man with a wash to mend and bees to tend and a long, quiet summer learns it. "They did the same to me near enough," I told her, because she'd given me a true thing, and a true thing is paid for with a true thing. And I told her about Lurin, and the one stone with 2 names, and the boy I'd buried with them, and the 20 years of being the thing rich men send. I had never told a living soul. She listened the whole way through without once making the face people make, the pity face that's really a person backing away from you. When I was done she was quiet a while, and then she said, "So we're both of us murderers by the town's accounting. You for what you've done, me for what I never did." A small terrible smile. "Funny pair." "Funny pair," I agreed. "I'm glad you came," she said, and then looked surprised at herself for saying it and got up quick to see to the lamp. But the trouble wasn't done. Ostrander was not a man to lose and walk away. He'd lost the mob, By morning the whole town knew the gun he'd hired had turned on him in the road and faced the lot of them down. And that did something to the town, cracked the brick of the story just a little, because if the killer Ostrander sent wouldn't burn her, a body had to start wondering why. Old Proot the storekeep was the first to wonder out loud. He came riding out a week later, hat in his hands, and stood at the gate and said he'd brought some sugar and some cloth for the missus, and couldn't meet her eye, and Esther took the goods and thanked him plain and did not make him grovel, which was more grace than I'd have had, and Proot rode off looking 10 years lighter. That was the first one. There'd be others. The town was beginning, slow and ashamed, to come back from the place Ostrander had driven it. Which meant Ostrander had to finish it fast, or lose it forever. He came at it through the law this time, which is how a clever wicked man always comes at last, dressed up respectable. There was a marshal in Drywood, a youngish man named Calder Boone, who'd taken the badge after the fire and had inherited the town's certainty about Esther along with the office, and who'd been Ostrander's man not out of wickedness, but out of the ordinary cowardice of a man who wants to keep his job. Ostrander had Boone ride out with a paper, a writ, he called it, claiming back taxes on the vain place that Esther had supposedly let lapse. Taxes Ostrander had quietly arranged to have assessed, and the notices quietly arranged to go astray, so that on paper the land could be seized and sold, and Ostrander would buy it at the courthouse steps for the price of the lien, all legal, all clean, and the water would be his and the murderess would be turned out with the law's own blessing and not a torch in sight. It was a good plan. It was nearly a perfect plan. The trouble with it from Ostrander's side was Loomis. Because Loomis had a bad arm now and a longer memory, and Loomis had ridden for Ostrander long enough to carry things in his head that Ostrander would not have wanted carried, and Loomis had watched his boss hang him out in that road to take a bullet for a job Ostrander wouldn't dirty his own hands with. A wicked man's worst weakness is the wicked men he's used and discarded. I'd been one of those myself near enough, and I knew the breed. So when Marshal Boone rode out with his writ, I rode into Drywood alone, and I found Loomis drinking one-handed in the back of the saloon with his arm in a dirty sling, and his face full of the particular black thoughts of a man who's figured out he was never anything to his master but a tool to be thrown away. I'm not going to pretend I gentled it out of him with kindness. I knew what moved a man like Loomis because it was what had moved me, once not money in the end and not threats, but the chance to be more than the thing you'd been used as. I sat down across from him and I said, "He left you in that road, Loomis, after how many years? He'd have let you bleed out and sent flowers to the funeral and docked your last week's pay. I know it, you know it." And I waited. And Loomis, who was not a good man but was a man, looked into his glass a long time, and then he started to talk. And what he talked about was a night 2 summers gone, and a can of coal oil and an order and the smell of the Vane house going up, and Tobias Vane's voice, and how he'd carried it ever since. Loomis hadn't lit it. I'll say that for the wretched soul of him. Ostrander had brought another man for the lighting, a drifter long since paid off and gone. But Loomis had stood the watch on the road that night, and Loomis had heard Tobias, and Loomis had spent 2 years watching his boss profit off a widow's ruin while the whole town pointed at the wrong door. And there was more. There was a ledger, Loomis said, Ostrander's own account book, where the canny fool had set down even his crimes in figures. Money paid to the drifter, money paid for the taxes scheme, all of it, because a man like Ostrander cannot help but keep count of what he spent, even on murder. Loomis knew where it was kept. I did not break into Ostrander's office and steal it. I want that understood too, because the law would matter in the end for Esther's sake. A thing won crooked can be lost crooked, and she'd had her fill of crooked. Instead, I went to Marshal Boone, who was at that moment standing in Esther's yard reading her his writ, while she stood there white and steady and refusing to take the paper from his hand, and I stepped up onto that porch and I said, "Marshal, before you put that woman off her land, you're going to want to hear what Vance Loomis has got to say, and then you're going to want to look in Burl Ostrander's account book, and then you're going to have to decide, Calder Boone, whether that badge means what it says or whether it's just a thing Ostrander bought you to wear. Boone was a coward, but he was not, I think, a wicked man, and there is all the difference in the world between the two, though they often end in the same place. He stood there with the writ in his hand and Esther's eyes on him and mine, and you could see the 2 years of easy certainty cracking on his face. "Loomis is a drunk," he said, "but weak." "Loomis is a witness," I said. "And there's a ledger. You're the law, so go be the law, or give me the badge and I'll go be it, and you can ride back to town and tell Ostrander his marshal quit. Your choice, but you're not putting this woman off tonight." It took 3 days. I'll spare the particulars, the ride to the county seat, the older circuit judge who'd never sat easy with the vain verdict, Loomis swearing it all out, the ledger fetched lawful with a warrant and laid open on a courtroom table for every soul in Drywood to see, the figures in Ostrander's own hand, the sums that did not lie, that a man cannot keep from setting down. 3 days, and at the end of them, the brand that 2 years and a whole town had pressed into Esther Vane was lifted off her, not by a gun, not by me, but by the truth said out loud in a room where everyone had to hear it. I have killed men, and I have faced down a mob, and I will tell you that the hardest and best thing I ever watched was the town of Drywood having to sit in that courtroom and look at what it had done. Old Prout wept openly. The smith couldn't lift his head. The 2 boys from the mob came to her afterward, hats in hand, and could barely get the words out, and Esther, and this is the measure of her, this is the whole of what she was. Esther took each of them by the hand with her scarred fingers and said, "You were young and you were lied to, and you came to your senses in the road that night before any harm was done. Go on home. It's done." She forgave them. She had more right to her anger than any soul I ever knew, and she set it down, because she was building something, and anger is no foundation for what she meant to build. They took Ostrander in irons. He did not go quiet, and he did not go with dignity. Wicked men so rarely have either when the figures are laid bare. He shouted that the town had loved him, that he'd built half of it, that they'd thank him for the water yet, and not a soul met his eye. The drought broke that autumn. As it happened, the rains came at last, and Mill Fork ran full and the big outfit stopped dying, and the whole bitter war over Coyote Wash that had cost Tobias Vane his life turned out, in the long arithmetic of God, to have been a war over nothing, the way they so often are. There's a lesson in that I've never been able to make come out clean, so I'll just leave it lay. That left me and Esther, and the place on Coyote Wash, and a whole heap of things unsaid. I figured I'd be moving on. That's the truth. A gun is a gun, and a town that's just learned to forgive its widow isn't in any hurry to also forgive the killer she's been keeping in her cottonwoods, and I'd done what there was to do, and a man like me knows when to be gone before he wears out a welcome he was never rightly owed. So one bright cold morning that autumn I saddled the gray gelding I'd never named, and I led him up to the porch to say my piece and go. Esther was standing in the doorway. She'd been crying, though she'd have denied it, and she wasn't a woman who cried, so it cost her to let me see it. "You're leaving," she said. "Figured I'd best. Before the town remembers what I am and decides one murderer driven out is as good as another." "And what are you?" she said. "Say it, you're so all-fired certain. Say what you are." I opened my mouth to say a gun, the way I'd said it my whole life, the word I'd hid behind because behind it there was nothing a body had to answer for. And I found I couldn't, because it wasn't true anymore, and she'd cured me of telling lies. The bees and the long summer and the woman in the doorway had cured me of it, and I stood there with the reins in my scarred hands. They'd scarred too, the bee work. Hers and mine matched now, and I could not say the one word that had been my whole self. "I don't rightly know," I said, "what I am, not any more. I knew before I rode up to your gate. I've not known since." "Then don't leave to go find out," she said. "Find out here." And then, because she was braver than me and always was, she said the rest of it plain, the way she said everything, no circling. "I'm not asking you to save me, Creed Halloran. I saved myself with a scattergun and a stubborn streak in the truth, and you of all men know it. And I'm not asking out of need. I've run this place alone 2 years, and I'd run it alone 20 more before I'd take a man out of need. She came to the edge of the porch. I'm asking because the place is too quiet when you ride to town, and I find I listen for your step, and I have not wanted to wake to an empty house in a long time, and now I do, and the only difference between the empty house I dreaded and the full one I want is you. That's the whole of it. I'm asking because I choose to, not because I have to. There's a difference, and after what was done to me, the difference is everything. Do you understand me? I understood her. God help me, I understood her better than I'd ever understood anything. I'm a hard man, Esther, I said. I've done hard things, I can't undo them. I'm not asking you to undo a one, she said. I'm asking you to stay and be the man who stood in the road. That man's enough. He always was. You just never had anybody tell you so. And she held out her hand, the scarred one, palm up, the way she'd held it out to those 2 ashamed boys, the way she held things out to the world that had only ever taken from her, open, freely, asking nothing it didn't first offer. I tied the gray to the rail. I have never untied him to leave again. We were married that next spring, when the wash ran high with snowmelt and the bees came back to work, by a circuit preacher in the little churchyard where Tobias Vane lay, because Esther would not be married any place that pretended Tobias hadn't been, and I would not have wanted her to. She stood at his stone a while first, and I let her, and when she came to me, her eyes were dry and clear, and she put her scarred hand in mine, and that was the whole ceremony, really. The words after were just the town's way of saying out loud what the 2 of us had already settled between us in the long quiet. The town came, all of it. The smith gave us a set of iron hinges he'd made by hand and couldn't speak for shame and pride mixed. Old Prout cried again. He was a great one for crying, and brought a bolt of the good blue cloth, because he'd noticed, the old fool, that blue was her color. Marshal Boone turned in his badge that spring and took up freighting, which suited him better, and shook my hand hard at the wedding and said, "You made me be the law." I don't know as I'd have got there alone. And I told him most men don't. That's why we live in a town and not alone in the hills, so we can shame each other into being better than we'd manage solo. And he laughed and said that was about the bleakest hopeful thing he'd ever heard, and I reckon it was. We never did have children of our own. That was a sorrow Esther had carried into our marriage and I'd carried in from my own buried life, and we made our peace with it together the way she'd made peace with it once before, quietly, holding hands in the dark. But there were children all the same. The Smiths' grandchildren, who came for the honey and stayed for the stories. 2 orphan boys off a broke-down wagon train who needed a place and a name and got both, and grew up calling me, a thing I'd never thought to be called and have prized above every other word I've answered to. The house filled up. It does if you let it. A house is just a thing waiting to be filled, the same as a man. Esther kept her bees till her hands were too stiff to work them, and then she taught the orphan boys, and they teach their own young ones now, and there's still a row of white hives along the south fence of the Vane place, our place, and the air over them is still loud and golden in the summer, and I am an old man who sits on the porch where she once stood looking at the hills, and I look at the hills, and I wait for her the way I learned to wait. Because she went on ahead of me 3 winters back, and I'll be along directly, and we'll lie under one stone, and it'll have her name on it and mine, and there'll be nothing on it about murderers or guns, because that was never the truth of either of us. That was just the word the town tried to brand us with before 2 ruined people looked at each other across a fence full of bees and decided to be the truth instead. They called her a murderess and rode out to burn her off her own land. And a hard man who'd been nothing but a hired gun for 20 years stood in the road and would not let them, and found out, in the standing, that he'd been a man all along. He'd only been waiting for somebody worth being won for. She was worth it. She was worth everything. I'd ride the 200 miles again tomorrow and 1,000 more, just to sit my horse at that gate one more time and watch her turn, unafraid, and look at me and know me and not look away.